you very much, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me here. I'm a biophysicist by training, but I've been working with computational neuroscience for about 30 years. So I'm not doing any experiments myself. I'm using other people's experiments. And some experiments have been done by my old friend who passed away last year, Walter Freeman. So I will start talking a little bit about his work and thoughts. So I will say a little bit about consciousness, free will, intentionality according to Walter Freeman, and Tommaso D'Altino, Aquinas, and neurodynamics, decision-making, and neurocognitive model. That's a model that I've been developing together with my PhD student Azad, who's sitting there, and some simulation results, and then some conclusions. And the motivation for this is that, of course, that current science cannot explain consciousness or free will, and yet it is so important for us as human beings and for a meaningful life. So it's really essential for us. Neuroscience even seems to have demonstrated that conscious free will is an illusion, as you all know, but willful acts require decision-making. So we are focusing on decision-making in our studies and want to understand the relationship between the neurodynamics that can be studied in relation to decision-making and which implications it may have. So Walter Freeman, he has been here many times. This is actually the picture taken here, and he was here last time at the Cognitive Neurodynamics meeting in 2013. He claims that the brain is not primarily an information processing organ, but a system for creating meaning, rather. And what does he mean by that? Well, he explains this shortly, that you need the animal. I mean, he's studying animals, primarily rodents. He has studied cats, but also primarily rodents. And primarily, he studies about the olfactory system. It has to do with smell. So the animal has to go for the immediate goals, such as food, shelter, or whatever. And that requires, of course, information from the environment. But intention, then, is an important aspect of this meaning. And so there are different alternative futures, and these futures or these alternatives have different values. So even for simpler organisms than humans, and the operations of predicting, planning, acting, detecting, and learning comprise the process of intentionality. So he got very interested in intentionality and found that this was essential also for many animals. So for example, for an amphibian, he made this drawing to try to depict the action perception cycle, which involves intentionality, and where you have the animal is exploring the environment and detecting what comes in or perceiving what comes in, evaluates the outcome of its actions, and then make new actions. And that is, in general, the principle also for us humans. So, consciousness in the neurodynamic view, according to Freeman, you don't have to read all this actually. It takes too much time. You can read just the yellow words, so you capture the main idea about it, because lack of time. So what it says is that intentionality in operation do not require awareness, whereas voluntary acts require self-awareness. And voluntary acts may be considered acts of free will. And then he describes it in terms of neurodynamical as a phase transition or a bifurcation. And he also says we cannot not make choices from the very nature of the neurodynamics which must be resolved. And then he says something very important, I think, in this discussion. No decision is ever totally free or determined, but it depends on you as a subject. And this is an expression of the free will, and he then refers to Aquinas. And actually, we have a video that, if you're interested in his discussion on Aquinas and intentionality, we had a dialogue here 4 years ago with Brian McCarles, who's sitting there, and it's about 1 hour, so it takes some time. But we also have another video that also concerns intentionality, not so much on Aquinas, but between a dialogue between Walter Freeman and Jean-Pierre Changeux, which was filmed at the Consciousness Conference in Helsinki in 2015. So I think and actually there is another video in between there, which was with Dennis Noble, who was talking about downward causation as an important aspect, as a prerequisite for free will to have any effect, or for consciousness to have any effect. You need to recognize that there are downward causation in biological systems. So, if you have 3 hours when you don't know what to do, you can go to this website. It's Agora's website. Okay, so Aquinas' doctrine, in very brief, it says that the self thrusts the body into the world in search of stimuli, and by this the self changes itself to conform to the impact of the world. This process of learning equals assimilation, which begins with an act of exploration followed by an internal change. So this came to be an aha experience for Walter when he found this, and he actually included this kind of thinking in his own research. Oh, sorry. So what it says about, you cannot use linear causality when you describe what is cause and effect in terms of an animal acting in an environment. You have to introduce this action perception cycles, as I mentioned before. And then it says there are 3 properties of intentionality: directedness, unity, and wholeness, which all could be associated with 3 stages of intentional behavior. In the first stage, the stimulus is categorized in primary sensory cortex, usually accompanied by an experience of emotion and value. In the second stage, different sensory modalities are integrated into gestalts, which are assigned time and place in the life history of the individual. And in the third stage, there is a global coherence over the entire cerebral cortex, resulting in a decision to act or not act. Actually, this is in the dialogue with Jean-Pierre Changeux. They agree on this part. So we come to decision making, which may be the most important of our cognitive processes related to behavior. It's crucial for survival of all higher animals and linked to sense of free will in humans. And this is what I said before, that if our willful acts should have any evolutionary effects, our physical body must be under the influence of our consciousness, which is an example of downward or top-down causation, where a high level of reality has a causal power over lower levels. So, if we just now look at the steps in the decision-making before we come to the modeling, we don't model the first step in our current model, the recognition of the present state of situation. We have evaluation of action options, the reward of punishment, a selection of action depending on needs, and re-evaluate the action depending on outcome. And this is just the general theory of decision making, and I'm not going to go into the details of this, but you can imagine, and we use this for our modeling. We define a value function that is actually this is described by Doya in a 2008 paper, which is really good. But there is a function depending on the amount of the reward, the delay of the reward, and the probability of that happening. And this can be seen, the different parts of the brain involved in these processes have been more or less identified, and there are certain parts which we find are more interesting than others. And that's primarily the amygdala, the orbitofrontal cortex, and the lateral prefrontal cortex. And if we look at it in a, this is not our work, so if we look at the process, the time process of different steps in the decision-making process, you can follow it from the frontal part of the frontal lobe, and then going back to the premotor areas. Now, as we all know, and we have discussed to some extent, but not so much, is that we are not as rational as we often believe or want to believe. And Kahneman, of course, and his colleagues pointed this out long ago, and of course you're probably all familiar with this idea of the system 1 and system 2. I think Till mentioned it this morning, this is something we have taken as an outset for our modeling also, that we have these two kind of systems, where we have a bottom-up, intuitive, fast, implicit, emotional system, that's system 1, and a top-down, deliberate, slow, explicit, and cognitive system 2. And these two together, the emotional and cognitive parts, are combined and to give behavior. And this is also something we use in our model. We find a good picture from our own model, so we use another one. So we use computational models then and try to simulate the different neural networks and their activities in these three parts, as I mentioned before, the amygdala, orbitofrontal cortex, and the lateral prefrontal cortex, as well as the interaction. So, and we also look at the internal and external context. We had a discussion on that this morning, and I'm not going to discuss it very much further right now. And okay, this is what I said. So we have used attractor neural networks. Actually, the basics of this is from John Hopfield's or Hopfield's nets, but we are more biologically oriented with regard to how we interpret the dynamics. I mean, it's primarily oscillatory dynamics that we model in our system, and so we also look at these oscillations as being result of excitatory and inhibitory neural populations. So this is the model that we have made of the two systems. This is system 1, the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex primarily, and then the system 2. Of course, it's not so simple in reality, but we have simplified it as to an extent that we think anyway we capture the main ideas. So these are the two systems. We have an external context and internal context that acts upon these systems, and we also have the action being fed back to our systems. So this is a perception-action cycle that is implemented in this in some way. And so these two, the activities here on these two systems are integrated, and the winning option that we have represented in these systems will give rise to decision and then to an action. And then it goes back, and we learn from our actions and the value of these actions. So next time we have a possibility to choose, we probably or hopefully choose a better thing than we did last time if we had failure. So where is free will here? Well, we think it might be up here, that is being related to LPFC and the activities there. But it could, and some people claim it may be at a later stage where free will comes in. And especially if you think of it, the Veto signal, but it might be at a later stage. So I'm not going to show you or describe the equations, but we have one stochastic part and one deterministic part. And then we have an input-output function And this function actually is related to our motivation. So the level of motivation is determined by this Q parameter, which is in some sense related to the level of neuromodulators, such as acetylcholine in our brain. And so depending on the Q value, we can have different, this is the output and this is the input. So we get different kinds of dynamics depending on the level of the Q. And this is again related to the different states or arousal of an animal. Okay. So this is what the dynamics looks like in this, or in a particular input. So it's the spatial temporal patterns that move across this 10 by 10 millimeter square of the cortex. Okay, I'll skip some of this. So we had a choice. I mentioned yesterday that we had an EU project on called Complex, which was about how we make a transition to a low carbon society. And the issue was then what makes us choose if we have options to go from home to work. Let's say we have a car, we have a bike, we have public transport. Which should we take when we travel in the morning? So if we have all these options available, what determines what options we actually take? So it depends on our different preferences. If we care for the environment, we might take the bike if we can, or at least public car, or a train or something. But if we are just not thinking so much about the environment and just want to get quick, perhaps, to our place, we might take the car. So we have different values that we say, due to the sustainable development ideas, that we have ecological and social and economic values that we give to each of these, and each of these options are attached with or are represented by a cell assembly, where you have synchronized network oscillations in these assemblies. And they are influenced by external as well as internal states. And the decision then is based on the winning response activity in these different options. And this is typical overlapping heavy cell assemblies that we are referring to. So I'm not going through this rationale for it, but you can be, some people are more emotional, some are more rational, and depending on different personalities, we can choose what is the final value for each individual in our simulation. So this is an outcome. We simulate the EEG of these systems, the three systems I mentioned, and this is for single electrode output and just the frequency that we measure. So in principle, this would be measurable with EEG and perhaps also fMRI together to see where the activity is taking place. So now the combined activity in system 1 and 2 is something like this. So if system 1, which is fastest, if the decision had to be made here, this is the time, and it's an arbitrary time. Let's say this is milliseconds. So if the decision is made very quickly, then we may take, for example, the car. We think, okay, let's take the car. But if we think a little bit more about the climate and all this, the effect of taking a car, we might actually end up to see, maybe it's quicker and also better, of course, to take the bike. So the bike is the final winning option in this case. So the time of the decision is crucial for the outcome. So how long time do we have to decide, to make a decision, is determining what is the final outcome. So, just to summarize some of the concepts I mentioned, I think that consciousness has a dual aspect, attention and intention, and cognition and emotion is related to that and relates perception and action in this. This is a perception, action, perception cycle, and cognition and emotion interprets that and is related then to attention and intention. And you can go past the cognition. So some animals, or in some states, you don't have cognition or emotion, then there can be a more direct relation. And consciousness in this respect would be the kind of consciousness that Björn talked about in fruit flies, for example. Okay, so the conclusions are that intentionality is best explained by subtlety in action perception cycle. The problem can be viewed as in the context of decision making, and we have modeled the three systems I mentioned, and where there are cell assemblies where their activity compete with respect to the levels. And the winning assembly with the highest neural activity wins. That gives rise to the decision. And we can have deliberate decisions are value-driven, which is typical for free will choices, in contrast to arbitrary decisions. And we have discussed that to a great extent, but we may discuss it even further. So the experience of our decisions and choices is also learned and may influence future decisions. So, I will give some acknowledgement to my student, Azadeh, and just the final implications is that our decisions and actions can affect the world much more than we usually think, and to be aware of what determines our decisions may be crucial for our existence. Thank you for your attention.